Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. The JSSJ graduate level certificate program in JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, empowers professionals with invaluable skills, tools, and resources to connect generations and ensure inclusive growth. Courses this fall include Israel, Palestine, and American Jewish Life, Generational Divides and Future Directions, Race, Racism, and Jews, and Binaries and Beyond, Justice, Gender, and the Future of Jewish Traditions. Secure your spot in fall classes and apply by August 5th. Go to usfca.edu/JEDI.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 441. Judaism is people. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we are looking back at all those episodes that we did about disability, disability justice, chronic illness, and how they intersect with Judaism, with how the Jewish future might look. So a lot of times we just do a series and then immediately have this kind of debrief episode. For various reasons, we are doing it a little bit a few weeks later this time. So I really want to reflect back on what the significance is. I mean, obviously, identities that are often not put at the center of Jewish life. And so that itself is a significant reason to focus on it. But beyond that, there's something that strikes me that I want to start actually with our most recent conversation with Sharoni Sibony, thinking about new ritual objects that relate disability and Judaism in various creative ways, because I think not only is that very cool from a disability standpoint, but it also feels like the direction of thinking that we've been all about from the very beginning of Judaism Unbound in terms of new ways of practicing Judaism growing out of new people being placed in the center of Judaism. So I'm curious where you take that.
Yeah, I love that conversation with Sharoni Sibony. Sharoni Sibony made this amazing set of, I was about to say ritual objects, but she didn't. That's the point. She didn't make them, but she visioned them and then created art depicting these creative Torah pointers, yads, creative ner tamid, like eternal lights in a synagogue that would tie to seasonal affective disorder, like therapy lights, all sorts of other things. What I love about it, I mean, I love many specific objects that she envisioned, and I think that it would be wonderful if they went from vision to reality. But I also just really see that as a model for what we should be doing Jewishly. Like a lot of what we focus on, and this makes sense, it's the most short term. What are we going to make? What are we going to do? What are we going to have in Jewish life tomorrow or in a year or maybe in a few years? When you back out and envision like a whole slate of ritual objects that would weave together chronic illness or disability with Jewish practice and do so in a way that empowers those who experience those disabilities, that's a bigger project. Not just what could we practically create. Like Sharoni didn't stop with the fact that like, oh, I'm probably not the one who can actually like manufacture these objects. That wasn't a roadblock or a hurdle. I think for a lot of us that becomes a hurdle. It's like, oh, sure, we could come up with cool ideas for amazing stuff, but well, why bother if we're not going to go and create it? And I think we should bother. I think that if people really acquainted, and I encourage all of our listeners to go back and listen to that episode, to go to our show notes for it and look at the beautiful artistic depictions that she made. But if we all did that, I think it would expand our toolbox of what it is to reimagine and create Jewishly. Because it goes from like, what can we do right now to, if we're really ambitious, if we really thought about the whole scope of Jewish practice, what would we create that doesn't exist yet? Even if we can't do it. It's like the exercise when you're planning a program where you're like, if you had all resources, if you had billions of dollars, what's the dream program you would plan? Like I was taught to think that way when I was learning how to like think of summer camp programs for cabin night. What could be if there were all resources, if we had all the time in the world? That's helpful. And so I'm glad that Sharoni Sibony brought us to that place. And I think it's a reminder of what we should be doing generally.
Well, I think that question of like whether or not you have the budget for something is really interesting in connection to all this, because it's like when you think about various Jewish ritual objects, like take tefillin, for example, you know, those are those things that you kind of strap onto your arm and your head. And I think that just in terms of the materials cost, I think it's probably pretty cheap. You know, like I don't really know that much about, you know, how much leather costs, but I imagine that like thin strips of leather are not particularly expensive. What ends up happening over centuries and millennia is that these things have to be made in this very particular way, and that they end up getting really, really expensive. And so now we think about tefillin as something really expensive, or we think about a tallis as something really expensive. That's a prayer shawl. And actually, it's a piece of fabric with some strings in the corners. That's kind of the nature of things over a long period of time. But then you kind of see a project like Sharoni's and you say, oh, well, how could we manufacture things that are really expensive to manufacture? But like, actually not sure that that's the origin of Jewish stuff. I think that Jewish stuff isn't supposed to be expensive, and that connects to disability in the sense that the obstacles that are there to connecting with Judaism don't have to be there, but they've grown up over such a long period of time in a world where people with disabilities were not being listened to, basically, in terms of understanding what those obstacles were, that people didn't really care that much. And these obstacles become structural in the way that the expensive things become structural. And so I'm really moved by the project that says, can I go on the drawing board and put together a way of experiencing Jewish life that actually would work for me? And that question about whether those things that Sharoni dreamed up would actually be expensive to produce or not, or impossible to produce, I would put that as another design element to take it to the next stage to say, okay, and how can we also make it really cheap or make it really easy to produce? And that mindset, I'm interested in that mindset being applied overall to Judaism. The connected piece that I'm thinking about is just this question of, does Judaism work for me? Is it helping me in my life with the things that I'm looking for help in my life with? And in a certain way, I feel like Sharoni in particular and this disability unit in general has helped me focus on this question of like, what is Judaism for? And it's not clear to me that it's like, it's doing something for the people without disabilities, and it's not successfully doing that thing for the people with disabilities. And it would be interesting to sort of reorient around that question and say, if Judaism was there to actually do things for people in their lives, how would it look different?
We actually are orbiting around a question that came up in our episode that wasn't part of this disability unit, but that was us talking about Shavuot and the reasons why we shifted. You could argue we shifted the calendar date of when most folks celebrate Shavuot. And the reason we did that is to make it more accessible. Now, did we make it more accessible in the sense that somebody who has certain physical disabilities or other forms of disability was more able to go? No, not really, because we didn't move the context of the event. It was on Zoom before we shifted the date. It was on Zoom after we shifted the date. What we did is we moved it from the rabbinic day of Shavuot, which this year was in the middle of the week, when very few people compared to otherwise were going to go. We know this from our data from past years, and those who would go for less time. So we could frame that as just a choice they're making, right? Like people are choosing to go or not go to an event. Or we could frame it as an event where a lot more people are going represents an event that is more accessible to people. We could then take from that, it is a point, it is a, I don't know, almost a halakhic factor. It is like something that makes a Jewish practice more permissible or more praiseworthy if it's more accessible to people. I'm coming to that Shavuot thing because I think what you're suggesting is like, if a ritual object, say, is less expensive, that's not, again, this is another thing that's not about disability, but if a ritual object is less expensive and therefore more people are able to use it, that shouldn't suggest to us that it's, for a lot of people, it's like, if it's easy to participate, well, that's a sign that it's like not a great Jewish thing. We want it to be hard because we want it to suggest that we're making this big commitment to either God or our community. And so we want it to be sort of hard. Now, does that operate consciously all the time? I don't know, but I think subconsciously is like, well, Judaism shouldn't be easy. I actually think maybe it should, or at the very least, it should be accessible. And that's where it gets back to disability. It's not just about moving a Shavuot event from a date where 200 people will come to a date where 500 will come in real time, which is basically what we did, and I support it. It's also about saying, what if those tefillin, talis, all the ritual objects you named, like, what if the ways to make them that are cheaper, we actually say, not only are those okay, we're gonna, like you could say, like, you're allowed to bend the rules. Like, that's one way that you could look at it, is like you make an exception if a ritual object or a practice is made more accessible for people. I don't really like that. That's like a world of exemptions, which is how a lot of legal rules operate, where like the main thing for everyone is X, but we will make exceptions for certain sets of people. We could also take away, no, it's not actually an exception. We're going to change how we think about Jewish ritual so that in general, the ritual objects we treat as most praiseworthy, the practices and, dates of holidays that we treat as most central are the ones that are accessible to people with disabilities, are accessible to people financially, and in other respects. Like, to me, and by the way, I think there are arguments for this even in traditional material. I'm not going to say there aren't opposing arguments. I think there are plenty of texts you could find historically that would push against this and say, no, you need to stick with the traditional thing, even if changing would make a practice available to more people. For our organization, our set of people, I think we should be centralizing the notion that Jewish rituals that more people, Jews and otherwise, can joyfully participate in are rituals that we are going to lean towards saying those are good to go. And we're going to do it very actively, and we're going to apply it to holiday events. We're going to apply it to ritual objects. We're going to apply it to the architecture of our spaces. We're going to apply it to the programmatic nature of our events. All of that should be part of our thinking. And not all of it is about disabled folks, but I think all of it can be generated when we listen to disabled folks.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And it helps me actually think a little bit about something that kept occurring to me as we've had these episodes. And I don't think I mentioned it on the episodes, if I recall, but I talked to you about it, which is that I have red-green color blindness, which I don't believe is classified as a disability in terms of like the definitions of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's possible that it does because, arguably it interferes with the major life activity, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't mean to say that my red-green color blindness is at the same level of disability as the folks that we talked to. And yet, as we were talking to them, I felt in my gut, like there's a feeling that I get when I'm looking at a color and don't know if it's red or green that's really unpleasant. It's like an unpleasant feeling in my body where I feel like so frustrated that I don't know what color this is. And I feel so frustrated that whether it's something beautiful or something that is just striking, and I simply cannot see that. And it makes me wonder, like, what is my experience of the world compared to people who don't have this? And by the way, like, it's not that I can't see any reds or any greens. It's like I confuse certain shades of it. And my wife is always saying, which ones are those? And I'm like, the ones that are similar. And she's like, none of them are similar. And I'm like, what? But to me, they are.
Well, yeah. And just to jump in super quickly, like, you're moderating repeatedly the severity of your red-green color blindness. You're naming in a really caring way the ways in which it's not the same degree of challenge to your life that many disabilities are. And what I soaked in from our guests who spoke to this were pretty much saying, like, we want you to understand that that is on the spectrum of disability. The problem is that we have diagnostically split the world into a binary between folks who are fully able-bodied, quote unquote, and folks who are fully disabled, again, quote unquote. What I was hearing from our guests is that it would be much better if we saw ourselves as part of a spectrum of disability wherever on that spectrum we are, which is all sorts of different places for every one of us, as opposed to being nervous that as somebody who is in most ways able-bodied, I'm not going to talk about the red-green color blindness, for example, because I don't want it to sound like I'm sort of applying the same level of challenge to my life that is much bigger for other people. Like, my sense from our guests is that they want us and others and everybody listening to think about where we are in that spectrum, as opposed to being like, no, I'm a separate category.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And that's probably part of why I'm saying it in this more moderating way. But it's also just to be descriptive. But it's more, many of us have I don't know what you call it, like subdiagnostic experience of the world where we feel like profoundly dislocated, to the point that what I'm trying to make the point about myself is that I feel this physically. Like, and I don't think that people necessarily understand that. I think they're like, oh, too bad you can't see all the reds and greens. But the truth is that, like, I feel it at a level of deep frustration. Ironically, this happens to me very often in terms of electronics, that the light that tells you if your thing is charging can either be red or green, and I can't tell, but I actually, I mean, that can seem a little petty, but like it actually like profoundly annoys me that I can't figure out if my stuff is charged. And the point of this whole thing is just to say that if everybody could kind of go into their own self and say, how am I experiencing elements of the world in ways that give me a sense of empathy for what people with disabilities must be experiencing? And what would that world look like where we all understood ourselves to be coming from that perspective? Because I think that, I don't know about all people, but I think that many people have something like that, which gives them like a profound sense of that they understand what it's like to be a person for whom the world as it is designed doesn't work in ways that cause you deep frustration at the very least, and much more than that for many people. In a way, I think that most American Jews experience Judaism the way I experience my phone charger. That they kind of understand that this is working for people, and there's just something happening here, but I don't get that. I'm struggling. I want to be part of this, but I'm struggling to find an ability to even understand what is happening here. I'm not seeing the world in the way that it seems like this ritual or this text is designed for people who see the world in a different way. And in the same way that we start to open up the question of, yes, of course, many of us live in a world where we say, like, gee, if we could redesign a building to make sure that it was more physically accessible for somebody in a wheelchair, of course we would want to do that. But what if we looked at that as a much larger need to make the world accessible? Where would that thinking take us?
I'm flashing to the ways in which, especially early in this unit, when we spoke with Julia Watts-Belzer, when we spoke with Lauren Tuckman, one thing I thought was super powerful was that the two of them, and also some of our other guests in this unit, were really frank that Torah is really ableist. Our Bible, our other texts, Talmud, etc., that are centered in our tradition historically. Look, am I going to say every page is ableist? No. Am I going to say that the overwhelming sentiment around many forms of especially physical disability, but I would argue potentially beyond that, is that they are punishments, that they are bad, that people who have them, in some cases, texts suggest that they may have done something wrong to warrant being given that disability. And what I really appreciated is being able to have that conversation directly, to say, like, our texts are just off base. And Julia Watts-Belzer is, especially in her book, Loving Our Own Bones, this is really clear. And I think because of the starkness of the ableism of our historic texts, this is kind of a practice run for how I would like to go about other conversations with oppressive tendencies in our texts. I think so often we're trying to apologize for our texts. We're trying to say, yes, of course there are ways in which a few thousand years ago values were disaligned with our own, but there's stuff we can find here. Sometimes we gotta be able to say, we're not okay with it. That, in a way, was liberating, to be able to have the discussion directly and say, you know what? It ain't good that we talk about physical disabilities in this way in our texts, and that the overwhelming undergirding idea is that to have these things is to make you a less than human being. We could point to characters, and we did this too, and I think we should continue to do this. We also did look at Moses as a paradigmatic person with a speech disability. Isn't it amazing that such a centralized leader in 4 of the 5 books of the Torah, that we recognize that person is disabled, and that's not sort of something they overcame to be a leader. It's something that is integral to their story. And we got to be able to say that our texts are harmful. And so my hope is that we can do that in other respects. And it's not just because I'm like an asshole and I think, oh, our time is so much more sophisticated than the past. And that's not where I'm coming from. It's that I believe we need to be able to create good Judaism when our predisposition is that by and large, our ancient texts, our inherited holidays, our inherited heroes and teachers, that they're sort of good until proven otherwise. Then that places us in a position where we're going to forgive things that stand in the way of those accessible forms of Jewish practice, those enlivening rituals, those holidays, etc., that we need. Because we're going to be saying, oh, well, yeah, I guess we could change this, but really, we don't have to here, because we can find a way that this story speaks to us, even if on the surface it feels like it's harmful. There's a place for that kind of thinking, but I think it has gotten so centralized that it's preventing us from creating the new reimagined kinds of Jewishness, Judaism that we need.
I think the question becomes, what do we do with those passages that are clearly ableist, clearly looking down at people with disabilities? And that was one of the things that I tried to raise in our earlier conversations, that in the Bible, there are a few things that are anti-LGBTQ. There certainly is an overall mindset that's obvious that that's not their sort of the Bible's preferred approach, but there's not a lot of really explicit stuff that is anti-LGBTQ. There's a ton of stuff that is ableist. That it's all over. It's all over the Bible. It's all over the Talmud. And my question for some of our earlier guests, Julia Watts-Belzer, etc., were, it's one thing to look back at those texts and to say there's some unfortunate lines about homosexuality that we want to either read out in some way or look past, but you can't quite do that with disability looking at our ancient texts. And that's where I want to make a little bit of a connection to Shavuot, because on our Shavuot Live event, one of the sessions was led by Abby Stein about anti-war texts in the Jewish tradition. And I remember somebody in the chat saying, but there's also a lot of pro-war texts in the Jewish tradition. How do you just deal with that? I mean, then it's like picking and choosing, but you can't really make the claim that Judaism is anti-war because there's all these pro-war texts, right? And I said in the chat that I don't think it's as simple as we look back at these ancient texts and we see, what does Judaism say about it? But I didn't quite have until then a really clear way of thinking about what's the alternative, because a lot of people say the alternative is just pick the ones you like or something like that, or pick the ones that are meaningful to you. And I think that in the past, I've actually said a version of that, because I've said, look, I'm not making an argument about what Judaism has always said. I'm making an argument about what I want Judaism to say moving forward. And so I'm sort of selecting the texts that accord with that position, and we're going to move forward with those texts. Whoever wants to move forward with those texts, come along with me. I thought of that, about that as more of like still a kind of a picking and choosing, like a choice that I was encouraging us to make. But the more that I thought about it at Shavuot, because for me, my wife asked on Shavuot, we were having dinner with some friends, and she asked, who here believes that their soul was at Sinai? Because, there's this Jewish idea that all souls who would ever be Jewish in the past, present, future, we're all at Sinai together. And only I raised my hand that I did believe that. And she was surprised. And she said, what are you talking about? Like, you don't believe that your soul was actually at Sinai? And I said, I believe that the story of the revelation at Sinai is not a historical story. I believe it's a mythic story that talks about what is always true. And I believe that we are always receiving revelation. From whom exactly, we can explore that in a different episode. But I believe that we're always receiving revelation. And therefore, my soul was at Sinai because my soul is here right now, receiving revelation, right? As is yours. every time in history is equally important as every other time in its capacity to receive revelation, which means both that when we have perspectives on ancient texts where we think that they're off base, that is valid. But I think equally important, it's important for us to have the humility to know that there may be things that we are saying today that will in the future be invalidated, either because we are being insufficiently open and progressive, or maybe we went too far. My take on those texts is that the people who were receiving revelation back then were bringing that revelation into the reality of their world, into the reality of their lives, including their biases, and that they didn't realize that those were choices. And their applications of that revelation were wrong. We can now recognize that that's the case, and we can sort of pick up from those texts what we believe remains true and sort of reject the parts that are no longer true without having to reject the text altogether, because we now have that text as kind of a historical artifact about how people in the past tried to incorporate that revelation. We can actually even pull meaningful, valuable wisdom out of texts that are biased if we want to, if we choose to. And one of the texts that we, I think, talked about, that it's so ableist, it's so terrible in the Talmud, that talks about how people with disabilities may have come about because their parents had sex in the wrong way, so to speak. And that text is wrong-headed on so many levels, including the idea that disability would be some kind of punishment. The message of that text is also, you can have sex any way you want, which is something that I think we approve of. And so I think that it's possible to even take a problematic text like that and pick up the stuff that remains true, which you might not be able to do if you just rejected that text altogether and never looked at it. You might not have as good of a source for you can have sex any way you want. So I'm not totally sure if all that is right. That's the revelation I'm receiving right now. But I think that there's something that sort of arose in these conversations about disability that also is connecting powerfully for me with some of this new thinking about Shavuot.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in you're comfortable with the notion that your soul was at Sinai. I mean, I think I would have abstained from the vote. I don't think I would have said yes or no to the question, like, do you believe that that your soul was at Sinai? I think I would have asked for clarification about what is meant. My sense is that if the answer, and my answer is exactly what yours was, if the question is like, do you think that you're part of this story, this mythical story that is central for a collective group of people called Jews that you're part of? Like, were you there in that moment of the story? For me, yes. I was there. I am there. I will be there. Like, it's a trans-historical, it's an across-time story that never happened in any one actual moment of time. It is happening in the sense of revelation. It is unfolding. It is a myth that exists at all time. It's like, I mean, the revelation piece, I will say, I like revelation as a noun less than I like revealing as a verb. Like, revelation as a noun sounds, and you kept on naming, and I don't know if you were doing this consciously or if it's just like the phrase you used, but you're talking about receiving revelation. And to me, receiving revelation, it's hard to get around how that presumes there is an external giver of truth or of values or of teaching or whatever. And then when each one of us receives that is an act of us receiving revelation that we can then sort of channel into the world. I'd rather just say, like, each of us, and part of this goes to my own theology and how I don't believe in a God that is external to me that could give me anything or do anything to me as a verb. Rather, I see the sum total of all existence as one collective whole that maybe a lot of days I'm comfortable calling God. And so for me to reveal, for me to channel some form of teaching is revelation, because, like, I'm receiving the revelation from the part of God that is my body and brain and soul or whatever, like, yes, whatever exactly that is. And so I wanted to throw that in there because I think it relates to all of this in that I believe Judaism lives in people. Like, that might sound really obvious and silly, and I'll explain what I mean. But like, Judaism, we talk about it as if it lives in abstractions or it lives in texts that then people read or people believe in or people agree with. And from that vantage point, you kind of have to figure out what Judaism is and what Judaism stands for, to use maybe an ableist kind of language that implies stands for is the same as believe. Plenty of people believe without standing. But like, to presume that we assent to Judaism that exists separate from us. And that therefore, I think the takeaway from that is that like, we kind of bend ourselves to fit Judaism. So if Judaism thinks X, my job is to either assent to X, agree with X, or it's to disagree with X, and I am being un-Jewish in that action because I am disagreeing with something that constitutes quote unquote Judaism. I don't think that's how it works. I don't think Judaism lives in principles or in texts that we then read and either agree with or disagree with. I think Judaism is the sum total of what Jewish people at a given moment do. And so whatever I do is Jewish. And the takeaway from that, and this is what like the thesis statement of this long rant is that we should be looking at our inherited traditions and texts not as the Judaism that we have to, oh my gosh, we either have to fit it to us, or we have to just, our hands are tied, we have to keep it the same, and I guess that means a certain set of our population is just thrown to the side. No, we use texts. We don't fit people to text. We're not going to say to somebody who has a physical disability that, oh, well, there's stuff in Leviticus about how that means you're not able to be a priest. And so we're going to take from that your physical body is a less than ideal manifestation of a human body and others are bad. Like, no, we're going to say the text was wrong. We're going to say Leviticus was wrong. Because Judaism, and that's not saying Judaism is wrong. That's saying we are shifting what Judaism is to better channel the people who are practicing it at a given time.
I fundamentally agree with what you're saying and with the perspective that you're bringing, but I become curious, how do we think about text? Like, what is the function of text? And not only text, but all sort of relics from the past. Oh, relics, I don't know if that's the right word, but all the things that we've inherited from the past, which includes holidays and observances and ritual objects and like everything, right? Everything is, what I'm sort of calling a text in a certain way. And they have value. And the question to me becomes, what becomes the relationship between us in our own time and problematic texts, rituals, practices, people, institutions, etc. And I think that what I'm trying to surface here is a question of like, I don't think it's so simple as they are wrong and therefore we should just have nothing to do with them. I think that the thing that I'm trying to surface with this idea of receiving revelation is that in the same way that, earlier, like, right, that you said like Judaism stands for, and then you yourself had the realization, oh, maybe that's ableist. I think that most people who say Judaism stands for something don't have that realization. And so there's a lot of, quote, texts in the world that say Judaism stands for X. And what the person was really trying to say is that there are certain principles that they believed were central to Judaism. That was kind of what I'm calling the revelation that they were receiving and articulating. By the way, I don't usually use that language. I'm using it here because it's kind of fun. But like my general use of that language, including God, is like, I think we're having this conversation like in a world where we're using all of these things as sort of metaphors. And I don't generally use the word God. I don't generally use the word revelation. But I think it's sort of valuable in this conversation. So I think that those texts, including the problematic ones, and that's why I'm so interested in the text about disability, because the problematicness is permeating all of Jewish texts. I mean, the vast majority of them are, if we had to just sort of say that a text that uses ableist language or a text that doesn't fully honor the role of people with disabilities is simply a bad text that should be completely sort of ignored, then I think we've actually we've gotten rid of a lot of our text. Now, maybe that's the answer. But what I was struck by with our guests was that they didn't go there. And I felt kind of invited by them to not go there, to say, and instead to kind of admire them for their ability to love Judaism and to even love these texts, despite their problematic nature with regard to themselves. And so that's inspiring me to try to hold up another possibility of the way that we relate to material from the Jewish past that is permeated with problematic elements, and to ask whether we can continue to have a relationship with those texts and find the wisdom that's in them under the surface of the bad stuff. Now, I think that we should then have an obligation to take that wisdom and write new texts, right? So that our descendants won't have to go to those texts for that wisdom. But I'm worried about doing that prematurely. That's the issue that I'm trying to raise here. By the way, I just want to also share one quick story from my Daf Yomi practice, my reading the Talmud 1 page a day. There was a fascinating text a few weeks ago where there was a person who was his job was to memorize the Mishnah, and that day they didn't have books of the Mishnah, and he was a memorizer, and he was talking to a rabbi, and he was telling him a certain thing that was in the Mishnah. I think it may have been a Braita, which is sort of like the Mishnah, but not quite the Mishnah. Doesn't matter. But the rabbi said, "Oh, that's wrong," and he said, "Oh, so should I delete it?" That's what it says in the Talmud. Should I delete it? And the rabbi says, "No, don't delete it. We'll reinterpret it." And I thought that was a really fascinating moment of, that made really explicit this Jewish approach that says, we don't so much like deleting.
Yeah, we're fully on the same page here, and it's an opportunity for us to clarify both to ourselves and to our listeners what rejection is. What does it mean to reject a text? Okay, I've said this a million times on the podcast. I think in math terms. And so let's say something has harmed the world. The text has harmed the world, and we're going to make up a quantitative value. It's harmed the world X, or maybe it's easier with an actual number. It's harmed the world 4. The amount of damage it's done to the world is 4. If you discard that text, if you never look at it again, the amount of damage it has done in the world remains 4. It doesn't get back to equilibrium. The way that you would shift what a text has done in the world from 4 to 0 or from X to 0 is that you have to do the opposite of X. You have to invert. So I'm making a distinction mathematically and Jewishly between inverting a text and discarding a text. To discard a text is to have it do nothing. Whatever it did in the past is the sum total of its eternal impact on the world, and then it does nothing more, good or bad. To invert a text is to say, look, everyone, this is not what we believe. But it's actually useful. It is a useful religious act to have a clear-cut text or model or prayer that stands for what we disbelieve. People love to say, oh, no. Don't be anti. You have to say what you're for. Sometimes the best way to explain to a room of people what you think about a thing is to say, this is the opposite of what I think. Maimonides famously made that claim about God. We can't say anything about what we think about God. We can only say what God isn't. And it is useful, in Maimonides' opinion and mine, to say what God isn't. I actually think saying God isn't a man in the sky with a beard, which is something people say all the time, I don't think that is doing nothing. I think we should keep saying that, because that actively shouts to a world where God has been painted as male, as in the sky, as a bunch of things that I don't like. Like, we should continue operating those notions in their inverted direction. So we have to say God isn't a man in the sky, because for a long time, people were believing that God lived up above. That's why sacrifices go up in smoke and the smell goes up, and something up there receives the smell. And so we invert it. And so for me, what you're saying is absolutely right. We should, and maybe we need to do a better job of it. I would love to have like a prayer service or a Parsha cycle, a Torah portion cycle or something, where we're actively saying, here's a set of things that we don't believe. This is a picture of that, and we're going to read this for the sake of doing the absolute value. Again, mathematically, like 3 and -3 have the same absolute value, which is 3. But if you look at -3, that helps you understand what 3 is, because it is the same absolute value. And so we're going to look at the story of Pinchas doing physical harm to an intertribal, interethnic couple in the Bible for the sake of saying we shouldn't be doing physical harm or other forms of harm to interfaith families in our community today. That is actually a useful text. I don't want to discard it. I want to keep it, and I want to say it for that reason. But we've historically not done that. Even progressive movements, what they've done is they've said, oh, this prayer, it says a thing we don't like, and so we're not going to say that prayer anymore. Or maybe we're going to shift what the prayer says to align with what we believe. We should have a prayer service that is actively stating stuff we don't believe for the sake of saying this isn't it. This isn't our sacred. I could see a lot of people critiquing it. It's like making a museum of all the worst things around. But I actually think it's a more effective strategy for us to name that these stories exist and have power and continue to read them. They're our bad stories. They're our set of rejected stories, but in the sense of stories we invert, not stories we discard.
Well, I want to say that I agree with what you're saying, or I don't disagree with what you're saying. In fact, I remember years ago, I proposed that on Yom Kippur, that should be the day that we read all of those texts that you're talking about, because it's a day of atonement and we want to atone actively for those texts. So I'm on that page with you. I just want to clarify that that's not what I meant to be saying earlier. What I meant to be saying earlier was a version of, let's say that there's a text, and I would argue that most texts actually fall into this category. It's not that a text has only done 4 units of harm. And I agree with you that if it was only harmful, then just rejecting it wouldn't be sufficient. Then you would want to do the anti-harm and everything that you said. But I'm suggesting that a text that has done 4 units of harm may have also done 1 unit of good. And what I'm concerned about is the rejection of that text, or the undoing of that text would do something about the 4 units of harm, but it wouldn't necessarily salvage the 1 unit of good. And that's what I'm trying to say about that text about the people with disabilities, that if we just rejected it, obviously that wouldn't solve anything. If we undid the harm of it the way that you're talking about, that would be good. It would be good in terms of a disability issue, but we would have lost a text, or we would have lost a principle that Judaism says you can have sex any way that you want. What I'm suggesting is that I appreciated our guests' willingness to find the good in texts also that are problematic in that way, and I'm interested in that project. Again, not only about disability, but about every subject. How could we salvage the good that those texts might have been doing? And by the way, I want to just emphasize that it's not about the text. It's about understanding the text to be almost like a container for the ideas of people, like you said, of people. And I really believe in wisdom, right? I really believe that there is knowledge that people gain through experience, through hard-won experience. And often that experience comes over many generations. So it's not just one person that got that knowledge. It's that a community gains knowledge over a period of time, often through suffering. And the Jews have suffered a lot. And I think that we've collected a lot of wisdom that we've then tried, right? This is the question, how is wisdom passed along? And it's often through things like stories or laws or other kinds of texts of that nature. So here were our ancestors, and they had understood something really deep about the human condition, and they tried to pass that along to us through a story that had some really problematic elements. And the historical experience has been to accept the problematic elements and sort of say, well, I don't know, I'm sorry, that's what Judaism is, I guess, and we'll have to deal with it. So I don't want that. But at the same time, I'm trying to figure out how we find those ancient vessels. It's almost like, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in these clay vessels. They protected it for all these years, and the vessel is now causing damage. Let's somehow get rid of the vessel, but without destroying, what was in it. And that's the project that I feel kind of called to take more seriously in light of our guests' remarkably warm attitude towards Jewish texts and Judaism more broadly, which has not been necessarily a great friend of people with disabilities.
I fully accept the amendment that you just brought around. To me, it's sort of distillation or filtration, where the act isn't to just take the 4 and get it back to equilibrium or even push it. It's to distill the pieces of a text or of a ritual or of a practice, whatever, that have done good in the world, and underline, elevate, expand those find the harm that's been done and do the reparative work on that, and then have our texts and our rituals and our practices do the maximal good that they can do in the world. I fully accept what you're saying, and I think that it requires us to know deep in our bones, to go back to loving our own bones and that framing, and it requires us to know that texts are not Judaism, that texts contain things that are the worst. I mean, texts are Judaism, but they're not the principal piece. They're not the core. They are tools that we mobilize for the betterment, hopefully, of ourselves and our communities and humankind, maybe even the universe. Like, that's what they're for. And I think that if we actively channel them that way, and if we distill the pieces that are best situated to do that and do that active inversion work for the pieces that aren't, then we'll be in a good spot. So I think we're going to close out this unit of conversations. We would love to hear your thoughts on these past episodes, on today's episode, whatever you've got. And as always, you can be in touch with us via a whole bunch of different platforms. First, there's our social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All of our handles are at Judaism Unbound. Second, there's our website, JudaismUnbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode, for our past episodes, all sorts of other resources. And there's our email addresses. You can email Dan and I at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. We also are, of course, grateful if you're able to support us financially with either a monthly recurring gift or a one-time donation, which you can go for at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.